Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, part of the highly acclaimed series of webinars that ACP, the Association of Contingency Planners, presents for both current and future members. For more information about ACP, please visit www.acp-international.com. My name is Ed Goldberg, and I serve as ACP's Education Committee Chair. My thanks to Gianna and ACP's headquarters staff at ADG in Albany, and my good friend Fred Rogers at Continuity Housing for their roles as webinar experts who work behind the scenes to ensure that these webinars happen flawlessly. And a big thanks to our webinar series sponsor, Continuity Housing. Continuity Housing guarantees pre-negotiated hotel rooms at substantial savings for the critical employees of larger and mid-sized companies in order to help prevent a business disruption in the event of a crisis. They've created a patent-pending guaranteed employee housing program which secures and protects hotel rooms for critical personnel and their families if needed while saving companies significant expense. Continuity Housing has a 100% success record with their deployments, and each member of their team has at least 10 years of experience. For information on receiving a free 30-minute consultation about your deployment housing needs, please visit continuityhousing.com or leave a comment on the survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. This and previous webinars are recorded and made available on the ACP website. Please feel free to share the link to the recordings with your peers and anyone you think might benefit from it. You'll receive a link to the recording after the webinar via email along with additional information on the topical content. Wait for that noise to die down. After today's webinar on Twitter, follow today's webinar on Twitter using the hashtag DRI webinar, and that's been added to the bottom of most of Al's slides. And you can follow DRI at DRI_International, INTL. That's their Twitter handle. Our topic today is business continuity management and cyberterrorism, how it affects us. And, you might want to mute for a moment, whoever's got their microphone open. Cyberterrorism, how it affects us, and what we should be doing now. Just when you thought that you saw the light at the end of the tunnel, it turned out to be the cyber-terrorist express. Business continuity management has become more entrenched in the means of delivering products and services upon which consumers and the general population depend. Any disruption in the process chain without a robust and dependable contingency plan can prove catastrophic to the fortunes of companies and even governments. Our guest expert today will examine case studies that show the value of including dependencies and why BCM is so essential to a holistic approach to resilience. It will also examine the effects of cyberterrorism in the context of the added exposure of supply chain and how government regulations are changing to address these issues. And finally, he'll explore the options open to organizations in providing risk transfer through the use of insurance. The savings blending of the forensic accounting performed by professionals can show quantifiable ROI when mapping impacts to insurance coverage. We are honored today to have as our guest speaker Al Berman. Many of us know Al Berman personally. Most of us know him as the president of Disaster Recovery Institute International, DRI. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Al and DRI are longtime supporters and sponsors and partners of ACP. Al is an MBCP, an NFPA committee member, a member of the ASIS BCP Technical Committee, member of the Committee of Experts for ANSI ANAB, a former member of the New York City Partnership for Security and Risk Management, president of DRI, and the co-chair of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's Committee to Create New Standard for U.S. Private Sector Preparedness Act. Over a career that has spanned 25 years, he served as president and CIO for a major financial institution, national practice leader for operational resiliency for PricewaterhouseCoopers, and global business continuity practice leader for Marsh. Al's been a keynote speaker for the American Red Cross, IBM, RIMS, FBI, Institutional Investors Forum. It's a long list. I want to leave time for him to talk. He served as a member of the Council of Experts for ANSI ANAB, and they set the credentialing standard for certifying bodies for PS Prep. He's a member of the Advisory Committee for Congressionally Funded Project for National Security Reform, member of the Standards Committee for the United Arab Emirates, and advisor to standards committees in Mexico and Singapore. His articles have appeared in numerous magazines and newspapers around the world, and he is often quoted in publications ranging from healthcare to financial services. And with that, we're out of time. No, actually, good afternoon, Al. Make sure you unmute.
Good afternoon, Ed. Thanks for making me feel real old. Thank you all for I'm sorry. Thank you all for attending today. We're going to talk about cyberterrorism, but we're going to talk about it in context. You've all read an awful lot about it. But let's start with a little bit about who DRI is and why my machine's not working. Do you get control back to me, guys? Let me try this again. Sorry. DRI, and it's funny, but I'm sitting in our public relations firm's office this morning talking about our mission statement and what we're trying to do and revise it. But for a long time, and currently, DRI is truly the international certification and education body, the largest in the world. We have certified professionals in over 100 countries. We teach in over 50 countries. Since 2009, DRI has taught more students outside the United States than within it. In fact, they now account for 40% of the certified professionals. The last number I looked at, we had about 12,514 certified active professionals, and we certified about 26,000. We teach in about 10 languages, and we expect that'll transfer into 12 or 14 languages by the end of 2015. We cooperate with an awful lot of governments, the United States, Mexico, the UAE, working in Nigeria. I'm working with members of FEMA, ANSI, and Ed has actually mentioned some of these, so I'll leave it alone. We partner with an awful lot of organizations, but we have been a foundation sponsor for ACP since the inception of foundation sponsors, and I'm a big supporter of it and understand the value that ACP brings to the industry. This DRI is not a membership organization. We are dependent upon membership organizations such as ACP to actually reach out to the membership and allow for knowledge sharing such as this. We've done awful lot with colleges. We're going to spend more time working with with educational institutions so that students not only come out of the university with an understanding of BCM and a degree, but hopefully a certification which will help them progress in the industry. 2 years ago, we were recognized by the Order of Sword and Shield National Honor Society, which is an academic and professional organization for Homeland Security, intelligence, and other security disciplines. And we are the largest of the institutions, and we are only the second of the non-educational institutions to be awarded chapter status. The good thing is we never solicited this. This actually came about by their review of our materials and our organization. We do an awful lot of corporate training, and I won't bore you with it. There are enough logos here to do that for me. The other thing is we've done a number of outreach publications, Drive, which comes out weekly to talk about issues facing the industry, and Thrive, which is our full publication. We do a number of regional magazines, as well as do conferences around the world, and we will be announcing some new ones probably in the next 2 or 3 months. But our objective is really to allow professionals to understand the issues that are facing them in their day-to-day work and what we understand and what happens from working on congressional committees and sitting in many of the government agency meetings to understand where we're going. But mostly we're here to represent the profession, to give it a voice, and we have been the voice of the private sector for an awful long time. I just came back from London to talk about cyberterrorism and how it affects Europe and what they're seeing coming out of cyberterrorism, new regulations. And our job is really to convey that information with information sessions such as this. 10 professional practices have been around for about 25 years now, and in a recent survey by BC Management, it's the most used standard in the world by far. And so we're very pleased with the fact that we have a freely distributed standard that people can use to build their plans and test their plans. About 3 years ago, we founded a charitable foundation, and the objective of that charitable foundation was to actually help people at times of disasters. So we've worked with Delta and the Red Cross and a number of organizations during Sandy doing distribution of blankets. We actually are working with Habitat for Humanity in the Philippines to help them rebuild housings destroyed by high-end. And you'll hear a number of times that people get to volunteer and do good things for the community. As a nonprofit organization, we have an obligation to do this, and we take it very seriously. So you'll hear about the initiatives we're doing and understand it's really for the aid of the community. We're working with a number of organizations on community resilience. So much for the advertising portion of this webinar. We're going to look at cyber terrorism, but we wanted to give you a context. I think everybody can tell you about war stories and what they've learned from it, and we've been intimate with a number of people who've talked to us off the record about what they found. So we will not be quoting what the organization, but we will tell you what we found out about cyber terrorism and what the risk is to us and how it really fits in with BCM. You know, we're going to look at it from historical, and I will not bore you with a lot, but I think it's important to look at the context in which supply chain all of a sudden became important in this country. Supply chain gets disrupted by almost everything, from fires and floods. One of the things we're looking at is, you know, what the impact of MERS, what happens during pandemics, how people react working when you can't have employee concentration and you need distancing. But we're looking at all the aspects of it as it affects BCM and as it affects the organizations. When we look at supply chain, we really look at two different models, and BCM in itself actually looks at 2 or 3 different models. One is obviously manufacturing, and we look at that from order to cash, from when the order comes in through the design stage, all of the process, and out to transportation, and finally, how do we bill customers and make sure we get our money? So when we look at the process, we look at all the individual steps. Transport has now become almost totally outsourced for almost every manufacturing company. And so the third model, which we're not going to talk about today, is the delivery model. But we will talk about manufacturing and how it differs from supply chain for service organizations. And when we talk about service organizations, we're going to talk about those organizations who produce nothing but paper or electronic paper, and those in the healthcare industry who actually deliver services as well as the education industry. But there's no real physical product that comes through. Nothing is manufactured. It is purely a service environment. And to a large extent, you'll see it has its own complexities. Oh, God. Talk about virus hunters. You'll have to excuse me. Let me just close this down. Thank you. I am about as sensitive to cybersecurity and cyber risk as anybody. The other thing is we'll look at supply chain and what companies are doing today and how they're dealing with procurement and strategic sourcing, look at inventory control, physical distribution. But the idea is that nothing, especially in the manufacturing world, no company has produced the entire product since Ford built a car in 1923 where they did windshields and they did tires. No longer happens. And so supply chain and supply chain disruptions become very important to how organizations work today. Disruptions in parts of the world, Asia in particular, Indonesia where we saw flooding, impacted a number of companies and a number of safety requirements that we'll talk to you a little bit about. I think the first case study we look at took place in March of 2000. Small fire, lightning, midnight, Albuquerque Philips microchip plant. Fire lasted about 5 minutes. It was put out immediately by the staff. The fire department never arrived. And when we looked at it, the pre-fire rankings were Nokia was the largest manufacturer of cell phones, Motorola was the second largest, and Ericsson was the third largest. And the problem is that the fire actually destroyed nothing. Unfortunately, the ash got into the ventilation system, and for those of you who know anything about chip manufacturing, one of the things that it requires is a clean room, i.e. no soot, no dust, because it impacts the way the chips and the conductors interface with each other. So what we saw was small fire, no big problem. And then we looked at the two planning processes. Now, Nokia was truly prepared for this. They looked at other plants that Philips had. They ordered chips from it. They understood the need was there and that there probably would be a problem. Ericsson, on the other hand, engaged in wishful thinking. They were told by the Philips people that it was a small fire, nobody was hurt, no property was destroyed. They didn't go into what happens when the clean room went down, i.e. it took them 3 months to clean it up. So they did very little in the process, whereas Nokia immediately went into action. The end of the story is, if you look at what happens, is I'm sure none of you have an Ericsson phone. 2 years after, in 2002, Sony invested $600 million to try to save Ericsson, and it didn't work. Nokia's story took a different turn. This year, Microsoft bought out their handheld division for $8.2 billion, which was a record and still is a record, so that they can launch their Windows platform. So the idea of having a business continuity plan and being prepared was the difference in being not only a survivor, but someone prospering, to literally going out of business. And that really set the tenor for what organizations started to look for from their supply chain. 2 years later, Motorola, not wanting to be affected by the same thing, said that they would not do business with companies who did not have a business continuity plan. To this date, it's almost impossible to find an RFP that doesn't demand it, and we'll talk a little bit about the regulatory environment. But companies realized that in order to have end-to-end delivery, they had to rely on their supply chain. And a breakdown in supply chain was going to cause them tremendous inconvenience, if not disrupt their whole entire business. And so more and more we saw companies starting to worry about supply chain and supply chain management. It's almost impossible to go to a major corporation, especially one that's in manufacturing, where there's not somebody for supply chain management. We were on the phone with a number of universities last week talking about academics, and they all talk to their supply chain degrees and in their master's program. So what we're seeing is a change in philosophy. It wasn't enough to secure your own facility, to make sure your own facility was robust and in compliance with regulations. You now had to worry about your supply chain. The next big case study took place in 2011. When we looked at what happened in what's now referred to as the Great Eastern Japanese Earthquake, the ensuing tsunami, and the meltdown at Fukushima. We were if you look at where we were in the middle of recovering after what looked like a Great Depression coming about in 2009, but industry had started to come back. And immediately involved in that was what happened in Japan. General Motors shuts down for lack of supplies. Chrysler all of a sudden can't produce trucks in black and red. Apple was much more interested in the iPad 2 was being announced, and all of a sudden it fell with back orders. There was huge chip shortages. Prices were increased. One of the things, for those of you who have some familiarity with the Japanese economy, it really lives and it's constructed such that it's small and medium-sized companies who are geographically close to each other. And so all case polishing is done in one place, all chip manufacturing is done in one place. And the reason for that, and many of you have heard this about the Japanese, that if one company is not able to deliver a product, its competition will actually help it deliver the product for them. It's a process called keiretsu. And it relies on physical proximity. Well, one of the things that happens when you have something the size of the earthquake in Japan and then ensuing earthquakes up on the southwest, the northwest portions of Japan, is that all of a sudden you disrupt the ability to deliver the product because of the geographical issues that come about from earthquakes and tsunami. I was in Japan, I guess November of that year, talking to the mayor of Tokyo and the mayor of Nagata, which is in the northwest portion and had a 7.2 earthquake. What we found out was that Japanese were relatively prepared for emergency response, although not of this magnitude. Just remember, we're looking at the largest recorded earthquake in the history of the world. but they had no business continuity plans, and that's why we saw this disruption in service. You look at how Japan affects the rest of Asia, and you can start to see the implication of what happened. The big problem is this will have long-term effects on the Japanese economy that has been faltering for a number of years. And so this is not only a case of business continuity, it's not a case of a corporation failing or an industry failing. We see the ramifications throughout the country. And it gave a change of direction to Japan. They started to move things offshore. And remember I talked about the fact that there's a geographic proximity to these companies. They actually reside next to each other. One of the big failings is, and the Japanese recognize this, if one of those companies were to move overseas, they're afraid all of them would move overseas. And so this whole issue of relocation for key suppliers and partners has really, really perplexed the Japanese government, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with this issue. Not only they move offshore, but Renesas, who is the largest producer of chips, has plans to increase its offshore production from 8 to 25%. They're in the low 20s now. Fujitsu is shifting its production to China, and it has shifted production to China. If you think about this historically where we are, China has just passed Japan as the second largest economy in the world. For them to actually be producing in China really is a setback for the Japanese economy. And not only that, but from a save face point of view, it was not what the Japanese had wanted to do, but the necessity to do it outweighed national pride and individual interest. And so we're seeing this shift moving out of Japan into China. One of the problems in moving to China was, I don't know if you remember, last year Apple moved a large portion of its production to China. And there was an immediate strike by the Chinese workers because they rebelled against the high standards that Apple has. And so there was a whole quality control and quality of product issue that faced Apple simply because of the shift from one place to another. And so supply chain has become more and more important to how we deal with the world. One of the things we've looked at is how do we look at supply chain within the context of business continuity. And what you see is this is really a BIA, and in part of that BIA is really when we start to look at external dependencies. And we started to look at them so that we interfaced with the issues that we face when we look at how do we decide whether a vendor will be reliable, what is the criteria by which we measure it, and what is the criteria by which we measure the vulnerability of that. And one of the things that we found out was we look at the corporation. S&P in 2009 announced that it was going to use risk management as part of the criteria for weighing the scores for S&P companies and talking about their creditworthiness. And so this whole issue is, are they a reliable company? Do they have a business continuity plan? What happens if they do have a major incident? How do they fall back on that thing? Two, how do we look at the vulnerabilities to the location? And finally, how do we look at the component vulnerabilities at the production sites? And so one of the things that starts to happen is we start to look at the risk criteria for supply chain. And what comes out of that, is actually a risk map, so that we're able to map the risk in supply chain just like we do in risk assessments and professional practice too. But you'll see we're able to look at the vulnerability by supplier and by supply risk and intellectual property risk and product liability risk. But we've started to weigh how do we evaluate our supply chain and our suppliers. And that'll become very important later on when we start to talk about the requirements by the regulators to do just that. But the idea is that if we don't look at end-to-end processing, we really will have substantial problems as we move forward. And so the context of this before we got into cybersecurity was really how do we look at it and how are we going to look at it as future? And obviously in the future we're going to weigh our ability in an enterprise risk model, I think. But also we're going to start to weigh the capabilities and the vulnerabilities, more important, of our supply chain and our vendors. We started to look at business continuity and enterprise risk as part of an enterprise risk model some years ago. And one of the things, and one of the best magazines you'll find is Risk and Insurance Magazine, who actually started to look at the emerging supply chain risks. And 2 months ago, the biggest risk they found was cyber security and cyberterrorism. They're talking about the incidents where cybersecurity and cyberterrorism actually affect the automated manufacturing process. After all, we've got a bunch of computers who are now running manufacturing plants. If you've ever been to one of the more modern plants, the only thing that you will see as human is a bunch of programmers running around on segways trying to fix machines. Almost everything is automated from the unloading of the raw materials through the whole production cycle actually onto the trucks that are delivering it. So a cyber attack on the manufacturing process wreaks havoc on it. A cyber attack on a service organization, like we will talk about, wreaks even more havoc because it reduces the confidence by which we do general online vending. Interestingly enough, in what we used to call the good old days, Ed remembers that, right? He's been around a while. We used to worry about natural disasters and man-made disasters and technology failures, and we were able to really quantify those things. Unfortunately, the risk started to increase. We're in pandemics. Ebola has been the latest issue. We looked at NBC and nuclear and biological and chemical attacks, political ones, economic ones, and finally cyber attacks. The estimate for cyber attacks is somewhere in the 10 million a year to new U.S. companies and government installations, and you've heard about a number of them. But it's really become an issue for us, and how do we deal with minimizing risk, and more importantly, how do we recover from these things, and probably even more importantly, what is the government going to do about it? When we looked at the latest survey that came out of Value Walk, the biggest increase in spending that we're seeing from corporations this year is in cybersecurity and IT risk. It is absolutely the biggest board issue. I meet regularly with boards of directors for a number of types of organizations, and cybersecurity has become one of the biggest risks. I was on the phone with the UAE early one morning talking about just that, whereas disaster recovery and crisis management seem to have taken a back seat to this. Cybersecurity obviously is becoming a big problem for us, and we're going to try to understand how do we deal with it. In 1997, IBM did a survey on what hackers really do, and it was a bunch of amateurs trying to build a reputation. There are still sites where if you've been hacked, they will produce a few of your records just to show you how good they are. Well, that has turned now into what is really a commercial enterprise in cybercrime. The theft of information, the disruption has become massive. We actually do a study on supply chain for cybercrime. What happens after they steal your credit card numbers, and how do they actually parse that out so it moves from what is a wholesale distribution model to a retail model where individuals are using your credit card. And if you look at it, it almost looks like the illegal drug market. There's a wholesaler and they cut it down and pass it to a distributor. But this has become a new economy. Cybercrime is becoming the biggest threat to online economies around the world, and it's being affected everywhere. If you looked in the news recently, we saw almost everybody in it. I think this chart is about 3 weeks late, and there are 5 more things. But if you look at what happens is there's a protocol for dealing with cyber attacks with the U.S. government, and it's proved, for most cases, to be relatively ineffective. What happens is you report it to the federal government logs it and lets everybody know that there's been an attack. If you live in New York, it's almost akin to having somebody steal your bicycle and you report it to the police. You can be guaranteed there'll be a report. You can also be guaranteed there'll be no action. And so one of the things that you're starting to see is private corporations engaging in black ops and retaliatory measures against cyber criminals. It happened just recently where a corporation, which will not tell you who it is, took down a slew of servers in Russia because they had found out that they were trying to hack them, and they reversed the process and were able to it not only stopped them, but almost put them out of business. And so we're going to see more and more of how private industry reacts to cybercrime and how the federal government does. Just as an aside, the U.S. Senate has not passed a meaningful cybersecurity bill since 2002. There are 4 pending in front of the Senate as we sit. But my feeling is that the industry has prevented much of that from happening because of the fact that they don't trust the government with corporate secrets. And when you talk to organizations in the United States and abroad, you will start to hear that opinion, especially in the private financial services sector. But we really have to find a way to deal with this. I mean, one of the ways to deal with is to understand how it fits in. For those of you familiar with Target or not, it really started with a trusted source, a third-party vendor, a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning vendor in Pennsylvania. One of the things they did when working with Target is that they actually transmitted their invoices electronically. Well, the hackers figured out that the easiest way into the system was to find a trusted vendor, put the virus within that message, and have it uploaded. And that's exactly what they did. What they then did is they gained access to some of Target's point-of-sale system, cash registers, and they actually did a test hack to see how many credit cards they could steal. Interestingly enough, they didn't want to put the data back on their servers, so they hacked a couple of servers, one in Miami and one in Brazil, and actually stored the stolen data on hacked servers someplace else in the world, so that even if you traced it back, you would find it on some innocent servers. After they ran the test case, they then decided to spread the rest of the point-of-sale system and get live credit and debit information, which wound up in Russia or in Eastern Europe, and then was distributed around the world. One of the issues that just came up is Target obviously was protected because they really used other people's credit cards and other banks. The banks are now suing Target because they think that they failed to perform the due diligence so that they could have protected that information. And this will be a recurring theme, and you'll hear from attorneys about what their obligation is to protect private information and to provide the same kind of security from their vendors, and as well as what the credit card companies are talking about. So when we look at the regulatory changes, we will start to talk about this and why it's important. But the real truth is the supply chain weakness really affected their customers, and it affected it in a way that even Target didn't expect. Retail sales fell. Retail sales fell. The price of the stock dropped about 4%, and they started to lose customers. As they were one of the first big hacks, the publicity did them very little good, and customers really were concerned about their reliability, and that continues to plague Target and will plague a lot of other people as the hacking continues. I know everybody is concerned, but the government is particularly concerned. So if you look at the healthcare industry, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, has passed what is an omnibus rules, and what it's saying is that there is a requirement that we now look at vendor due diligence. The same thing is happening at the FFIEC, which charters all nationally chartered banks in the United States. They want to look at third-party providers. They want to look at key suppliers. They want to make sure business partners are diligently protecting their networks and their softwares the way they are. And they're running a cybersecurity assessment pilot, and they ran it for about 500 small banks, and the results were very upsetting. I think every bank at some point had a vulnerability that they found, and before they roll it out to the larger banks, they're going to try to figure out what the policy is. And so you're seeing the FFIEC now being a lot tougher. But more importantly, the OCC, the Office of Controller of Currency, which is an arm of the U.S. Treasury, is starting to put down hard responsibilities to all of the financial institutions. We're also seeing it come out of FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Agency, who again is looking at cyber security threats. And finally PCI, which is a credit card processor. And the issue with them is that any of you who process credit cards, and DRI uses a lot of credit card payments, your rate, the rate that the bank charges you for processing credit card, is directly related to the certification you get from PCI DSS. And so if you fail that accreditation, the cost of processing credit cards goes up. So it becomes more and more important that you really do comply with these. When we looked at the OCC, which is probably the best defined of the regulatory bodies, and if you're in banking, you'll know all about the OCC, they are starting to push this into risk management. Talk about risk management, proper due diligence in selecting third parties, written contracts, contingency plans. They really are starting to put down very stringent, more importantly, auditable rules for banks, and at the start of 2015, they will start to enforce those. And so when you look at the OCC and its power, if you work for a bank, the OCC is actually the auditing body for you. The FFIEC puts down the guidelines, but the OCC has a responsibility as part of the Treasury, the Department of Treasury, to oversee this. We're also seeing it in healthcare. So if you're part of HIPAA and you deal with electronic patient history information, you're going to see, again, risk assessments of vendors. How do we test vendors? Looking at what the vendors are doing. And in essence, being not worried about information corruption, they're more worried about information theft, because from a penalty situation, each time some piece of information covered by HIPAA is revealed, it costs an organization $10,000. Recently, there was a settlement of about $12 million for an outsourced vendor who revealed 800 records. And so the need for cybersecurity policy, for cybersecurity assessment, for cybersecurity governance starts to increase and really moves into the business continuity world. We have to be prepared to work with the risk managers, the cybersecurity people, in a full enterprise risk area. Even the U.S. government has come out now and started to talk about security assessments for bidding. It's something that has been long overdue. But the government is saying, we're not doing business with you unless you can do these things. System contingency plans, security assessments. They want to look at everything that you do to make sure that you don't wind up affecting their ability to deliver services. And probably more importantly, their ability to protect themselves against cybersecurity risks. Just a little bit about insurance and to talk about where you can get a real ROI. When we look at business continuity, we do a lot of BIAs and we do a lot of strategy selection, but unfortunately we don't incorporate them into the same stringent requirements that we have with insurance. So if you look at a BIA, you should be able to understand what business interruption insurance and contingent business interruption insurance helps you in the way of risk transferring the risk from the organization to the insurance company. The other thing you'll find is you need to optimize extra expense insurance. And as quick definitions, business interruption protects you from loss of profits and continuing fixed expenses, and only in the event, obviously, it's a covered event, which means there's physical damage. But the idea of it is that if we know a lot about this when we do our BIAs, we know the revenue loss, we know the profit implication, and we actually can work with the insurance people on getting more effective insurance. One of the things that we found out was a lot of companies are overinsured because they don't take into consideration the mitigation of loss that comes about when you have an effective business continuity plan. And we have all of the numbers, and there are lots of stories about how you can save money. I worked for a healthcare organization a long time ago, and we came up, somebody found out that I knew something about insurance. I called in by the CFO, who wanted to increase the amount of insurance they had from business interruption insurance from $35 million to $50 million. And I said, well, I don't understand why. And he goes, well, we're a $3 billion company. And I go, yeah, but your profits were only $170 million last year, and you're right. And $100 million came from the interest in the $2 billion reserve you had in case hospitals needed it. So you had a $70 million operating profit. You're going to insure that for $50 million, when in fact we know that your business continuity plan will kick in, and the most you'll be down for is 2 days. What we wound up doing is reducing it to $15 million, 1.5, and saving them $600,000 in premiums. You're looking for an ROI, here's the positive possibility of doing that. The other thing is you'll see when you talk about supply chain is contingent business interruption insurance, which is the same lost profits and extra expense that results from an interruption. The good thing is it also affects not only your supplier, but if your biggest customer should have an action that makes them unable to purchase your product, you're insured for that as well. So when you're starting to look at BIAs and you're in the process of doing that, it really is important that you talk to the insurance people, and really you can show what the value of business continuity is. The other thing is extra expense, the expense to repair or replace property. And so when you're looking at strategy, it's very, very important to look at where your extra expense insurance is. I have a friend who was a CIO for a major organization. They had a flood in their server room, and Greg automatically decided that he needed to order new servers and immediately went out and ordered $7 million worth of servers, which came a day later, and he was able to bring up the organization. The problem was the extra expense insurance didn't kick in for 48 hours, and had he waited, he would have paid less than $1 million for those servers. In Greg's case, CIO stood for career is over, because the CEO said, didn't you understand what the insurance implications were? So it really is important that BCM members actually start to talk to risk managers and insurance people. This is just a chart that you can use to understand where each of the policies fit in. The last thing we'll talk to you about is DRI 2015, which is really, DRI is a nonprofit organization. This is a charitable foundation. But one of the things you'll get to do is volunteer and work with us. It's an interesting conference because on Saturday we're all in jeans and T-shirts and sneakers, and by Tuesday night we're all in formal dress. But it really is for volunteerism and to understand the people we have there speak at almost no other conference, the ability to network, and then we finally have a recognition award that really recognizes outstanding work in business continuity from both organizations and individuals. And this year will be held in San Antonio. I'm done.
No, not so quick. You can't get away that quickly. We have
You mean I'm not going to get my overtime?
A little bit. How would the risk-based rules by the OCC have stopped or prevented the target hack?
I think it would have meant, I'm not sure anything stops hacks, and we have to be really honest about it because we tend to be reactive. But the OCC would have forced organizations to actually perform due diligence. And what we're seeing from a lot of them is their vendors are signing off saying they can be held accountable for any losses of corporation. And so maybe it wouldn't have prevented it, but I think that some of the software that we use on our systems, we could have helped other vendors look at. So whether it would have prevented it or not, we would have at least performed the due diligence that the OCC says we're not doing today.
Okay. Yeah, one person who asked, well, I don't know if it's a question, but you can comment on it, I'll comment on it too, but he said most companies don't share their business continuity plans with each other because they're considered proprietary.
I think that's true, but one of the things that Ed, you and I both know it, is that there is a certain amount of camaraderie that comes with practitioners. And it's one of the reasons we hold this conference, so that we can actually network and talk about what we do without revealing corporate secrets. So I think it's important that we share that. We'll be announcing some more sharing sessions that will help. But I think organizations like ACP contribute greatly to that because there is an exchange of ideas, as you know. And that exchange of ideas actually influences what we do as a group. The other thing is that there are organizations, especially financial services, that actually amalgamate some of the things that are happening, and they may not identify the company, but they will identify the incident and how they handled that incident, which is equally important.
Yeah, that's kind of where I would go, is that basically, a good conference is a great place to go, to learn what others are doing, do a sanity check, network, and so forth. ACP is a great great network. That's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it. My thing is that we share freely. We wouldn't share a specific plan because that's like giving a roadmap of your vulnerability. So you can't share that, but you can share the template. You can talk about what goes into it. Nobody competes on the basis of preparedness. It's very different than most other professional organizations where, you know, if you've got a better way of doing something, you don't want anybody else to know about it. And in this case, that's not necessarily the case. So you know, my response would be, you know, join ACP, go to a good conference like a DRI conference, and network. And I think you'll find that people do share quite freely in this business.
The other thing is we actually keep an informal database of those comments that we share with organizations around the world when they talk about what the issues are and how some people have handled it. So, for example, if you look at BCM at one of the major banks, the person responsible for retail BCM is now responsible for vetting people in the procurement process. So they're actually looking at this supply chain and have integrated it into the process they have at BCM. And I have a feeling that after we talk to a number of other organizations, they're going to reorganize around the same lines to augment the now procurement procedures with making sure that these people have continuity plans and cybersecurity plans.
Great. So now I got a whole bunch of questions, so we'll do...
You were supposed to give me easy questions. Are these easy ones?
Yeah, these are speed dating. Speed dating questions. How does cyber risk insurance differ from basic property insurance, BIEE? Business interruption.
There are 7 different kinds of insurance being used for cybersecurity today. And I'd be glad if somebody would send me a question to give them all that information. But it goes all from the realm of some things like shell shock, where information has been stolen, to actual cyber destruction of things. It's interesting when you look at all of the policies, they cover so many different things that even the insurance industry is telling you to get your legal counsel involved. And I think that's good advice. But if you'd like more information rather than spending time detailing all 7, I'd be more than glad to send it to you.
Okay, great. Just as a reminder, everybody, that this is being recorded, and you can listen afterwards if you miss any of this. This will be amusing to you. To become certified, which should I pursue, MBCI or CBCP?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things, and I don't want to toot our horn, but we are by far the oldest and largest of the organizations, and our standards are a lot more stringent than everybody else's. And we're proud of that. Everybody who gets certified by us passes our qualifying exam. One of the things and why corporations prefer CBCP is we require continuing educations that are modeled after AICPA, what CPAs do, and the American Bar Association, American Medical Association. That means that you have to take 80 credits of continuing education every 2 years, or you lose our certification. We are very, very adamant about the fact that what looks like BCP today doesn't look like what it did 6 years ago. And you know, if you take the analogy with the AMA, it would be tough to go to have your brain surgery done by a guy who hasn't picked up a book in 10 years, because BCI certifies you for life. As long as you pay the money, they continue your certification. And that's why our certification has grown by leaps and bounds. Even during the bad economy, the number of certified professionals increases about 15% a year.
And this is a good segue. How do we grow the next wave of continuity workers to cover this growing need that's growing globally?
We can talk about what we're doing. We're working with a number of universities to actually put in BCM courses so that the next generation will be prepared. We run a number of seminars, free seminars. We'll be running a lot more of them next year. But we think that part of it is to introduce people to this. We have an intern, DRI has an intern program where we bring in interns every year. We work with a number of corporations on interns. We think that's what we need to do, is to have the schools understand what we're doing. And it's been really gratifying, the results that are coming out of the colleges who really want to talk to us. So I think it needs to be in secondary education. At our conference, we're going to announce a number of things that will actually help this process, because we take this nonprofit portion of our business very seriously. We think we need to educate this next generation, and more importantly, make sure they have a job after they're educated.
Yep, good point. Will the new DRI risk certification cover the aspects of business continuity risk that you mentioned?
The risk course that we now have is an analytical course that will help you do risk evaluation better in your organization. It absolutely ties into business continuity as an extension of the professional practice. But we've just finished the first class. We're about to do the second class, which has been already filled by a corporation. It will give you that, what we think is a much more balanced view of what risk management does. But really, it's a risk evaluation course. So it will help you work with risk managers to evaluate what the physical and logical risks are, and actually be able to quantify some of those.
Okay, great. We're really running short on time, and let's do one more, and then there's let me ask you this, and you can say no if you want, but we have about 10 or 12 more questions. If we get those questions to you and you put together answers, we can send them out to the people that are...
Absolutely. I'll do it over the weekend. You'll have it back by Monday. Okay,
great. Here's the last one. Outsourced IT providers produce a SSAE 16 SOC1 or SOC2 report, but exclude BCP. How does the client know or feel they are being protected?
I think that's a big issue. I think one of the issues that we're seeing, not only in outsource but in cloud technology, whether private or public, is SLAs. So that we're looking at service level agreements that clearly define what we can expect from the vendor. In past times, we used to turn over things without realizing they had no recovery plan. And it's become a big issue, especially when you start looking at the cloud. And more we're seeing the reliability increase. The CIA, for example, just signed a contract with Amazon. So we're seeing that reliability, but you still have to do that same due diligence required of any vendor. You're simply looking at another vendor, and if you don't do that due diligence, I can tell you the courts are going to find you negligence. And negligence is not something you want to fight because you want to have, because it really may nullify your insurance.
Great. Thank you. So right now, if everybody would stay on the line for about 30 seconds, I'll give you some information that I think you'll find valuable, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Before that, Al, I want to thank you for a great presentation. That was really very enlightening, and I know by the questions, volume, and the nature of them, it's a great engaged group. Thanks once again to Continuity Housing for sponsoring the entire ACP webinar series. Remember to visit continuityhousing.com or leave a comment in the survey if you're interested in how they can provide your critical employees guaranteed housing when they need it most. Be sure to watch the ACP website for future webinar information. If you found this valuable, and there's others of a similar nature, and we actually have quite a range of webinars, we actually have 3 this month, please consider joining ACP, and we also have local chapters that you might find incredibly valuable for networking as well. As a reminder, this and previous webinars are recorded, made available on the ACP website. Feel free to share the link to the recordings with your peers and anyone you think who might benefit from it. You'll receive a link to the recording after the webinar via email, along with additional information on topical content and those questions that we didn't get to, along with the answers from Al on those. And I believe there's a brief survey that comes up with it as well when you close your browser. If you get that, please take half a minute to answer the questions. It really helps us refine our productions for you, choose topics that would be of interest, and hopefully we do a good job of that. Thank you again, and have a great day.